She thought she knew exactly who he was. She was wrong about everything. Vanessa Sterling, 30 years old, CEO of one of the most powerful defense technology corporations in America, had a husband she barely acknowledged, a quiet security guard who brought his daughter to work on weekends, a man she passed in hallways without making eye contact, a man she considered, if she considered him at all, an obligation her dying father had forced upon her. Then, bound and bleeding in an abandoned warehouse, with zip ties cutting into her wrists and her captors arguing over what to do with her body. The lights went out, and the man she had spent 3 years looking through walked out of the darkness. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because every week we bring you stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop a like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one is going to change the way you see the people standing right beside you. The underground parking garage beneath Sterling Defense Technologies headquarters smelled the way it always did after midnight: engine oil, stale concrete, and the particular silence that comes when a building empties out and stops pretending to be anything other than what it is. Steel and glass and ambition stacked 42 floors into the Virginia sky. Vanessa Sterling walked fast because she always walked fast. Heels on concrete, sharp and deliberate. Her leather portfolio was tucked under one arm, her phone in the other hand, a half-eaten granola bar forgotten in her coat pocket from a lunch she never actually sat down to eat. The board meeting had run 4 hours over schedule. Her neck ached. Her assistant had texted her twice asking if she needed the car pulled around, and she had ignored both messages because she needed 20 uninterrupted seconds where nobody needed a decision from her. She was 30 years old, and she was exhausted in the specific way that powerful people get exhausted. Not from too much work, but from the constant performance of being certain when nothing is certain, of projecting confidence in rooms full of men twice her age who were still waiting for her to crack. Her father had built Sterling Defense into a billion-dollar institution. When Harrison Sterling died 2 years ago, he left the company to his daughter, and the board had spent exactly 18 months trying to find polite ways to suggest she step aside. She hadn't. She wouldn't. The garage elevator opened with a soft chime and she stepped out, moving toward the reserved executive row where her car waited. She noticed the overhead fluorescents on Section C were out. 3 bulbs, maybe 4. She filed it automatically. Facilities maintenance request, Monday morning, and kept walking. She was 40 feet from her car when she heard the footsteps, not the echo of her own heels. Something heavier. Multiple sets. Vanessa stopped. The instinct wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the same animal alertness that had gotten her through 22 consecutive quarters without a single losing report. The recognition that something in the environment had shifted and the numbers no longer added up. She turned. 3 men. Dark clothing. Moving with purpose toward her, not wandering, not confused about where they were going. "Ms. Sterling," the one in front said. Not a question. She opened her mouth, reached for her phone. She never got to dial. She came back to consciousness in stages. First the smell. Diesel fuel, old wood, something damp underneath both. Then sound, muffled voices somewhere to her left, one of them agitated, one of them low and deliberate. Then the zip ties, which she registered before she remembered why they were there. Vanessa kept her eyes closed for 3 full seconds after she woke up. She ran a mental inventory. Hands behind her back, ankles free. Chair, wooden, with a loose crossbar she could feel under her left foot. Head ached on the right side. She'd been hit, or hit something. She wasn't sure. Phone was gone. Portfolio was gone. Coat was still on, which meant either they hadn't wanted to risk a struggle or they planned to keep her presentable for something. She opened her eyes. Warehouse. Industrial windows with most of the glass knocked out, replaced by nothing, open to the November cold. Overhead, what looked like the structural skeleton of a loading crane, long dead. Concrete floor with oil stains that had been there so long they'd darkened into the texture of the floor itself. 3 portable work lights set up in a triangle arrangement, throwing harsh shadows in every direction. 4 men that she could count, probably more beyond the light. The one who'd spoken her name in the garage was standing near a folding table, looking at something on a laptop. He was tall, mid-50s, wearing a tactical vest over civilian clothes. He had the focused, unhurried manner of a man who'd done this before and wasn't particularly concerned about being interrupted. "She's awake," said someone behind her. The man at the laptop looked up. He studied her the same way she studied balance sheets, looking for the relevant number and ignoring everything else. "You're not going to be here long," he said. "How comfortable the next few hours are depends on how cooperative you feel." Vanessa's voice came out steadier than she expected. "You have any idea how many federal statutes you're currently violating?" "Several." He returned to the laptop. "We don't need you to talk. We need you to not talk, specifically to your board, your legal team, and the Department of Defense Contract Division, for approximately 72 hours. After that, certain transactions will have cleared and you won't have a company to talk to anyway." She understood then. This wasn't a ransom situation. This was a surgical move, someone attempting a hostile acquisition through a combination of blackmail, fraud, and her convenient temporary absence. Someone who knew the timing of Sterling's quarterly disclosure. Someone who knew which transactions were pending. Someone inside the company. She thought about who had access to the information this required. Security codes. Her personal schedule. The garage exit route that bypassed the main lobby cameras. The list was short and the names on it all held senior positions. "Smart," she said despite herself. The man looked up again, mildly surprised. "You chose a window between my quarterly board meeting and the federal audit. My CFO has signature authority for 72 hours under the emergency protocol, and if I'm unavailable, the next 2 signatures cascade to—" She stopped. "Someone on your payroll." He almost smiled. "You're faster than the profile suggested." "People usually are." He went back to the laptop. Conversation over. Vanessa sat with her hands zip-tied behind her back in a collapsing warehouse, and she thought, with the cold, methodical part of her brain that had never fully learned to panic, about everything she should have paid more attention to. Her father's voice had a specific quality when he was serious. It dropped half a register and slowed down, like he was placing each word carefully on a shelf to make sure it wouldn't fall. He'd used that voice the afternoon he told her about Grant Calloway. She'd been 27, sitting in the hospital room where Harrison Sterling spent the last 3 months of his life arguing with doctors about treatment options he'd already decided against. Her father was 61 years old and still formidable, even in a hospital bed, reading glasses on, papers spread across the rolling tray table, managing the company from his room because he physically could not stop. "I need to tell you about an arrangement I've made," he said. "What kind of arrangement?" "A legal one, involving you." He set down his reading glasses. "I need you to hear me out before you react." She hadn't reacted well. The story came in pieces. A man named Grant Calloway, 34 years old at the time, recently left the Navy. Father of a 6-year-old girl. Harrison had encountered him through former military connections. The specifics vague in the way her father's stories were always vague when he didn't want her asking follow-up questions. Harrison had been watching Calloway for some time. He trusted him. Specifically, he trusted him with Vanessa. "You want me to marry a man I've never met? I want you to be legally bound to someone I know will protect you when I can't. Dad, the company will make you a target. The moment I'm gone, there will be people who see you as a door they can push open. I'm not talking about board politics. I'm talking about people who operate outside board politics. And you think a security guard? I think Grant Calloway," he said, with the deliberate patience of someone choosing each word carefully, "is the most dangerous man I've ever met in my life. And I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." She'd thought he was delirious, medication effects, the specific sentimentality of dying men who want to believe they can arrange the world into safety before they go. She agreed to the arrangement because her father asked her to, because he was dying, and because she told herself it didn't have to mean anything. She filed the marriage certificate. She arranged for Grant Calloway to be placed in the Sterling Defense Security Department at a position and salary that she privately considered charity. She never used his last name. She never introduced him as anything. She told herself she was honoring her father's wish while not being bound by it. She had not once, in 3 years, asked Grant Calloway anything about his life. The voices near the table got louder. 2 of the men were disagreeing about something. The tall one, she'd started thinking of him as the coordinator, was on a phone call, his back turned, his posture stiff in the way people get when a plan is not going exactly as expected. One of the others moved closer to her, younger, maybe 30, with the edgy energy of someone who'd been standing in a cold warehouse for 3 hours and was running low on patience. "Comfortable?" he said. "Relatively." He crouched down to her eye level. Up close, he had the look of someone who had done security work or military service long enough to learn the mechanics of intimidation, but not long enough to lose the need to perform it. "You should be more scared. I'm sure that would be more satisfying for you." His expression flickered, annoyance, and beneath it something she recognized from boardrooms, the frustration of someone who expected to have more power in the interaction than they actually did. He stood up and walked away. Vanessa pressed her left foot against the loose crossbar under the chair. It had give. Not much, but some. She began working it, slowly, rhythmically, with the patient pressure of a woman who had learned a long time ago that the only problems worth solving were the ones right in front of you. She didn't think about rescue. She thought about options. Then the lights went out. Not all of them. The portable work lights stayed on. But the overhead industrial panels, which had been flickering at the edges anyway, died completely. Someone outside cut something, or the aging grid in an abandoned industrial building gave up on itself. 4 seconds of confusion. The men near the table moved. Someone shouted something. The coordinator's phone call ended, and he barked a short command. Vanessa stopped moving her foot against the crossbar. Something was wrong. Not for her. Wrong for them. The first sound was brief and low, like something heavy meeting resistance. Then a second sound, sharper. Then nothing, and she couldn't locate the third man anymore by the sound of his breathing, which she had been tracking unconsciously since she woke up. The fourth man said quietly, "What the?" And then he stopped saying anything. The coordinator spun around. He was good. She'd grant him that. His hand was already on his weapon, and he was moving toward better cover, processing the change in the room faster than most people would. He wasn't fast enough. The movement that took him down was economical in the way that only trained things are economical. No wasted effort, no drama, nothing extra. Just 2 specific applications of force in rapid succession, and the coordinator went from vertical to horizontal so fast that his body hit the concrete before the sound of the first impact had finished echoing. Emergency lighting clicked on 3 seconds later, the thin amber glow of backup systems, just enough to see by. Grant Calloway stood in the middle of the warehouse floor. He was wearing the dark navy jacket of the Sterling building security staff, which struck Vanessa as so strange in this context that her brain briefly stalled on it. Same jacket she'd passed 100 times in corridors. Same company logo on the left breast pocket. His breathing was controlled. His hands were at his sides. He was scanning the room with his eyes in the patient, methodical sweep of a man checking corners, and he didn't look toward her until he'd finished. Then he looked at her. "You okay?" he said, matter of fact, like she'd tripped on the parking garage curb. She stared at him, 37 years old, a face she could not have described in detail if asked, because she had never actually looked at it. Medium height, solid build, dark hair going gray at the temples. 3 years of passing each other in hallways and elevators, and once, memorably, in the company cafeteria where she had walked past the table where he sat with his daughter without stopping. He had always looked like furniture. Necessary. Placed correctly. Unremarkable. He did not look like furniture right now. "The zip ties," she said. Her voice came out strange, like a sound coming from somewhere slightly outside herself. He crossed the space between them, and she saw the coordinator on the floor, alive, breathing, but deeply unconscious, and the young one near the wall, folded into a position that suggested he would not be getting up on his own schedule. Grant knelt behind her chair, and his hands were at the zip ties, and gone in under 10 seconds. He handed her the cut pieces. Then he stood up and offered her his hand, not in the solicitous way of someone helping a delicate person, but practically, efficiently, the way you'd hand someone a tool. She took it and stood. "There's a car outside," he said. "The police are already en route. I called it in before I came in. We need to be outside before they arrive, so we're not explaining this for 4 hours." She stood there in her ruined coat in the amber light, looking at him. "How did you find me?" she said. "The garage camera on level B2 has been malfunctioning for 6 weeks. He said it the way you say a fact. No inflection. "Facilities keeps closing the ticket without fixing it. I've been running manual checks on that level during third shift rotations because of it. You saw them take me. I saw the vehicle. I had a general direction. The rest took a while. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not cold, not warm, something between professional assessment and something older than that. You should have a security detail, Ms. Sterling. Not Vanessa, not your wife. Ms. Sterling. She almost laughed. She was not sure why. Grant, she said. He was already moving toward the warehouse exit, checking the space as he went. Grant! She said it louder. He stopped, turned. The amber light fell across his face, and for the first time in 3 years, Vanessa Sterling actually looked at her husband. At the set of his jaw and the way he held himself, not the stiff, self-conscious posture of a man performing vigilance, but the natural stillness of someone for whom readiness was not a performance. At the small scar that ran from the edge of his left eyebrow toward his temple. At the hands that had cut her zip ties without fumbling in the dark. You don't move like a security guard, she said. Something crossed his face. Very briefly, like a light seen through a closing door. I'll get you home, he said. And he walked toward the exit, and she followed him, and neither of them spoke again until they were outside in the cold November air, and in the distance the first sirens were coming. Vanessa looked at the back of her husband's head, the man she had paid a salary to for 3 years and never once wondered about, and felt the specific cold discomfort of someone who has been wrong in a way that isn't easy to account for. She pulled her coat tighter. The sirens got closer. Grant stood between her and the dark road with his hands at his sides, watching the tree line, absolutely still. The police took 4 hours anyway. Grant had wanted to avoid exactly that, and it happened regardless, because that is generally how things go when a woman gets abducted from a federal defense contractor's parking garage and her husband dismantles a 4-man crew in an abandoned warehouse in Fairfax County. There were forms. There were separate interview rooms. There was a detective named Okafor who kept asking Vanessa the same questions in slightly different order, the way detectives do when they're checking whether your story changes shape under pressure. Her story didn't change shape. She was precise and sequential, and she left Grant's name out of it for the first hour without fully understanding why. Then she stopped doing that and told them everything she actually knew, which was 4 men, organized, informed by someone with internal access, corporate espionage with kidnapping as a mechanism. She told them about the security codes they'd used to redirect the garage cameras. She told them about what the coordinator had said regarding the 72-hour window and the transaction clearance. She told them she suspected a board-level leak. She did not tell them she had spent most of the preceding hour sitting in the back of a police cruiser trying to remember if she had ever, in 3 years, asked Grant Calloway a single question about his life. She couldn't remember one. Grant was in a separate room. She caught a glimpse of him through a narrow window in the hallway, sitting across from 2 detectives, jacket still on, posture relaxed in the precise way that is actually the opposite of relaxed, the kind of stillness that comes from training rather than comfort. He wasn't gesturing. He wasn't performing anything. He was simply answering questions, and she couldn't hear the words, but she could see the detective's body language shifting, the slight lean forward that meant they were trying to figure out who exactly they were talking to. She understood the feeling. They released her at 3:40 in the morning. A company car took her home. The driver blessedly did not try to make conversation. She sat in the back seat with her coat still torn at the shoulder seam from where she'd worked against the zip ties, watching the Virginia suburbs scroll past the window, and she did something she almost never did. She sat with a problem she didn't know how to solve and didn't try to solve it. She just let it be there. Grant Calloway, her husband on paper. A quiet man with a daughter named Sophie who brought drawings to the security desk sometimes on the weekends. Vanessa had seen them once, taped to the inside of the guard station window, small crayon drawings of what appeared to be dinosaurs in business suits. She had thought, briefly, that they were charming in the way children's drawings are charming, and then she had kept walking. She thought about the way he'd moved through that warehouse, not like a man responding to a situation, like a man who had spent a significant portion of his adult life in situations exactly like that one, and had survived all of them, and had developed an economy of motion that comes only from doing something dangerous enough times that your body stops wasting energy on what doesn't matter. Her father's voice came back to her, low and deliberate. I think Grant Calloway is the most dangerous man I've ever met in my life. She had thought he was being sentimental, attributing heroic qualities to someone because he needed to believe in them. She pressed her fingers against the cold window glass and watched a traffic light pass through red to green to nothing. She thought, I don't know this man at all. Then, following close behind that thought, quieter, and that is entirely my own doing. Oh. She slept badly and woke up at 6:15 to 11. Missed calls and a security briefing request from her chief of operations. She responded to none of them. She made coffee. She was not good at making coffee, never had been. The machine in her penthouse was one of those automated systems that her assistant had configured, and she'd never learned to override. And she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her 41st floor apartment with a cup that was too strong and slightly too hot, and looked out at the city, waking up below her. Then she opened her laptop and started digging. She had legal access to Sterling's employee files. She had broader access than that, if she was willing to use her executive credentials to pull records that weren't technically her department's concern. She was willing. Grant Calloway, hired 38 months ago at the third-tier security officer level, hourly rate, benefits. His file was clean, current, and thin in the way files are thin when someone filled in the minimum required information and nothing more. Emergency contact, a woman named Ruth Calloway, listed as sister, with an address in Roanoke. No prior employment on file beyond a single line, U.S. Navy, 2005 to 2019. 14 years. She switched to a different search, not the HR system, something broader. She had relationships with 2 private intelligence contractors through Sterling's defense work, and she used those relationships now in a way that made her slightly uncomfortable, because this was not technically a business matter, and she knew it. What came back took 40 minutes to compile and another 20 minutes to read properly. Grant Thomas Calloway, born in Roanoke, Virginia, 37 years ago. Enlisted at 18, transferred to SEAL training at 22, completed the program on his second attempt, the first attempt ending with a broken collarbone in the final phase, which he apparently came back from and completed the following year. 14 years of active service. Multiple overseas deployments, locations partially redacted. Decorations including a Navy Cross, a Bronze Star with Valor device, and 2 commendation medals that had no corresponding public record. She had to look up what a Navy Cross was. She sat with that for a moment. The file continued. She read through the operational summaries that existed in declassified form, which were few and fragmentary. The nature of SEAL operations being that most of them do not appear in documentation that can be accessed by a defense contractor CEO on a Wednesday morning with her coffee going cold beside her. What she could find was partial, impressionistic, but enough. Then she reached the notation at the end of his service record. Medical separation, September 2019. Circumstances. Post-operational review, classified. Status, honorably separated. Cleared of all findings. She read that twice. Cleared of all findings. The language of an official process that had concluded without formal consequence. She pulled one more file. A general news archive search, cross-referenced with his unit designation and the dates that partially appeared in the service record. She found a piece from a foreign correspondent, published 2 months after the date of his separation, discussing what was described as a failed extraction operation in a location identified only by a regional descriptor. Several civilians had died. The operation itself was attributed only to U.S. Special Operations Forces. No names. The journalist noted that a military investigation had cleared all personnel involved, attributing the civilian deaths to intelligence failure at a level above the operational team. It was possible, likely even, that it was not the same operation. The dates aligned, but she couldn't be certain. She knew she was building a picture from fragments, and that the picture might be wrong. But the cleared of all findings language, combined with the timing, combined with what she now understood about the way Grant Calloway moved and held himself, and didn't flinch in an abandoned warehouse at 3 in the morning. She thought about the nightmares she hadn't known to look for and now suddenly could guess at. The way he sat at that security desk. The careful, patient containment of a man with too much interior space and not enough he was willing to talk about. She pushed the laptop away. The coffee was cold. She poured it out and stood at the sink and thought about her father and the deliberate way he had chosen his words, and how he had never once suggested to her that marrying Grant Calloway was about anything as simple as protection. She drove herself to the company offices at 9. She had a driver, technically, but she never used him unless she was working in transit, and today she needed the 20-minute drive to think. She thought about how to have a conversation with someone she had treated as invisible for 3 years. She didn't come up with a good approach. Grant's shift started at 11. She knew this because she'd looked it up that morning in the scheduling system, which felt like an odd thing to have to do regarding one's own husband. She waited until 11:40, which was longer than she wanted to wait, but less performative than arriving at the security desk at 11:01. Then she walked down to the building lobby. He was at the secondary station near the east entrance, running badge verifications for the maintenance crew that came through on Wednesdays. He had his head down over something on the desk, paperwork or his phone, she couldn't tell, and he looked up when she approached because people trained the way he'd been trained apparently noticed things arriving from the periphery without having to look for them. He straightened. "Ms. Sterling." There it was again, that particular formality. She found it more grating now than she ever had before, though she understood it was probably her fault. She had established the dynamic and he was maintaining it. "I'd like to speak with you," she said. He looked at the maintenance crew line, which was still 3 people long. "I have a shift handover at 2. I'll wait." She did not wait. She went back upstairs and tried to work through a budget review for the 4th quarter and accomplished approximately nothing for the next 2 hours. At 2:15, her assistant knocked on the office door to tell her there was a Grant Calloway waiting in the lobby. She went down. They walked to a conference room on the 2nd floor that she knew was empty on Wednesdays. She didn't offer him coffee. He didn't ask for any. She sat down across the table from him, and he sat down without any of the studied casualness people deploy when they're trying to appear comfortable in situations where they're not. He looked at her and waited. "I ran your file," she said. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise. Closer to the acknowledgement of something expected. "Okay," he said. "Navy Cross, Bronze Star, 14 years, specialized operations." He didn't respond. "You were cleared in some kind of post-operation review in 2019. Shortly after that, you resigned, moved back to Virginia, and applied for a position in this company's security department at the lowest available pay grade." She paused. "You understand that makes no sense on paper." "It made sense to me at the time." "Grant." She said his name the way she had in the warehouse, deliberate, with weight behind it. "I need you to talk to me." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table surface, not at her, and she could see the small tension in his jaw that meant he was making a decision about something. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything." He looked up at that. Something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before or hadn't been paying enough attention to see. A kind of assessment, but also something underneath it, something that had been living in a quiet place for a long time. "That's a big ask," he said. "I know." She kept her voice level. "I realize I don't have a lot of standing to make it. I haven't asked you anything in 3 years. I know that. I'm asking now." He was quiet again. Longer this time. Outside the conference room window, she could hear the low background hum of an office in the early afternoon, phones and distant conversation, and the specific urban white noise of a building full of people who didn't know each other's lives either. "There was an operation," he said finally. "Late 2019. Overseas. We went in to extract a foreign national who was giving intelligence on a weapons trafficking network. The intelligence on the location was wrong. The structure we were told was a safe house was being used by a local family. We went in fast." He stopped. There were children in the building. Vanessa didn't say anything. 3 people died who shouldn't have been there. The review cleared the team. The intelligence failure was at the agency level, not ours, officially. He looked at the table again. "Officially. You don't accept that." "It was my call," he said. "On entry. I read the structure and I made the call, and I was wrong." He said it plainly, without flourish, the way you state a fact that has been stated so many times it no longer requires emphasis. 3 people died because I was wrong. The review. I know what the review said. He said it quietly, not sharp, but with the absolute finality of someone who had been having that argument with himself for years and had stopped expecting it to resolve. "It said I wasn't responsible. That's a legal determination. It doesn't change what happened." The conference room was very quiet. Vanessa sat with what he'd told her and felt the inadequacy of anything she might say in response to it. So she didn't say anything. She let it be there. After a moment, he continued, "I left the Navy 8 weeks after the review. Sophie was 6. Her mother had been gone 2 years at that point. I took Sophie to Roanoke, stayed with my sister for a few months, and then came here. He paused. Your father contacted me. We'd crossed paths before, through a former commanding officer who moved into defense consulting. He knew my record. He offered me the position. He told you about the arrangement. He told me about you, about the company, and what you'd be inheriting, and the kind of attention that attracts. He told me he had one daughter, and she was going to need someone close who knew what he knew. Grant looked at her directly. He didn't ask me to be your bodyguard. He asked me to be present, adjacent, in a position where I'd know if something was wrong before it became wrong. And the marriage. He said legal proximity, said it would give me standing in certain situations that informal employment wouldn't, medical decisions, emergency authority, that kind of access. A pause. He said he hoped it would never need to matter. Vanessa thought about her father arranging all of this from a hospital bed, reading glasses on, papers across his tray table, still managing everything even while he was dying. She thought about how she had interpreted his concern as sentimentality, as the fear of a dying man unable to let go. Why didn't you tell me? She said. You didn't ask. It landed simply. Not as an accusation. He said it without any edge, almost matter of fact. But it sat there between them with the particular weight of a true thing. She opened her mouth and closed it again. I know, she said finally. That's fair. He looked at her again, and for a moment the professional distance dropped. Not all the way, not completely, but enough that she could see the actual person beneath it. A man who was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, who had been carrying things a long time, who had come to a quiet place and told himself it was where he was supposed to be. What happened in that warehouse last night, she said. The 4 men. You handled that alone. I had element of surprise in a building I'd already walked 3 times. You'd been in that building before. I ran the district's vacant industrial properties after your last board meeting. The Harkins Road corridor was the best grid intersection from the B2 garage exit. If someone wanted a short transit window with no camera coverage. He said it like this was obvious, like it was the kind of thing any reasonable person would do. Vanessa stared at him. You mapped the possible abduction sites, she said slowly. Not sites. Routes. I mapped the most probable routes and the most probable terminus structures. When? About 8 months ago. He registered her expression and something almost uncomfortable crossed his face. Not embarrassment exactly, more the slight shift of someone who has revealed a habit they weren't planning to explain. There were some threat indicators in the vendor communication logs. Nothing specific. I flagged it internally and got told it was outside my purview. You flagged a kidnapping threat 8 months ago. I flagged irregular communication patterns that suggested the possibility of coordinated threat activity. He paused. No one acted on it. I did what I could with what I had. She leaned back in her chair and pressed her fingers to her temple. The headache that had been building since she woke up that morning chose this moment to arrive fully. 8 months, she said. You've been doing this for 8 months and nobody, I never... She stopped talking because finishing that sentence would require her to say out loud that she had employed this man for 3 years, paid him a salary. She privately considered generous charity, passed him in hallways and elevators, and never once noticed that he was actively running protective intelligence operations on her behalf from a guard station in the lobby. She pressed both hands flat on the table. I need you to tell me everything you found, she said. The vendor communication patterns, the threat indicators, all of it. I need you to walk me through it because whoever set up last night's operation had access to information that only a handful of people in this company have, and if you've been tracking the communication patterns for 8 months, you probably have a shorter suspect list than I do. He nodded once. I can do that. And I need you to come off the security rotation. He went still. That's my job. I'm changing your job. She met his eyes. Effective immediately, you report directly to me. No intermediate structure, no routing through operations. You work on this and nothing else until we identify who sold me to those people last night. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through some objection, some resistance that was partly professional and partly something older than that, some habitual reluctance to occupy too much space, to claim too much of something. I have a shift schedule, he said. I'll get it reassigned. Sophie gets out of school at 3:15. I need to be available if... I'm not asking you to change your schedule with Sophie. She said it more firmly than she intended, and then more gently. I'm asking you to do what you've apparently been doing anyway, but with the actual authority and resources to do it properly. He was quiet. She could not read his expression. Okay, he said, finally. She nodded. She started to stand. Ms. Sterling. She stopped. He was looking at the table, not at her, and when he spoke his voice had changed register slightly. Not the operational flatness of the preceding conversation, but something underneath it, less calibrated. What else did the file say? He said. The one you pulled. She stood very still. She thought about the news archive article, the failed extraction, the intelligence failure at the agency level, the 3 people who had been in the wrong place. Not much more than what you told me, she said. It was mostly true. He nodded, still looking at the table. She left the conference room and walked down the hallway toward the elevator and stood waiting for it with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and the specific, uncomfortable fullness in her chest of someone processing more than one thing at once. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. She thought about a photograph she'd found that morning in the archive search, a single image attached to a veterans advocacy article from 2021, captioned only with a first name and a military designation, showing a man sitting with a small girl on the steps of a rental house somewhere with a yard that needed mowing. The girl was maybe 5 or 6, and she was leaning against the man's arm. The man was looking at something to the left of the camera, and his expression was the expression of someone who had decided to be present even when presence was the hardest available option. She had not recognized him immediately. She hadn't been looking at Grant Calloway for 3 years, but she'd looked at the photograph for a long time. The elevator doors opened on 41. She stepped out and went to her desk and pulled up the internal communication logs from the past 18 months. And she started from the beginning, and she did not stop until she found the first thread that didn't belong there. It took her until 7 in the evening. When she found it, her hands were steady. Her head was still aching. She called Grant's number from her personal phone, not the company line, and he picked up on the second ring. She could hear in the background the low sound of a television and something that might have been a child's voice briefly before it quieted. I found something, she said. So did I, he said. I was going to call you. She sat up straighter. What did you find? One of the board members has been using an external encrypted relay to communicate with a vendor entity that doesn't exist in our contractor registry. The relay bounces through 3 addresses before it goes dark. I've been tracking it for 6 weeks. She was already pulling up a different window on her screen. Which board member? He told her. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. The name he said was the name she had just been looking at in the communication logs. It was the name attached to the thread that didn't belong. It was the name of the man who had sat 3 chairs to her left at the board meeting that had run 4 hours over schedule, the night someone was waiting for her in a darkened garage. We need to go to the federal investigators, she said. Not local police, federal. I know. A pause. It's more than just him. The relay connects to a secondary entity that's been acquiring Sterling stock through nominee accounts for the past 7 months. Someone is positioning for a takeover. The kidnapping was meant to create a 72-hour governance vacuum. She thought about what the coordinator had said in the warehouse. Certain transactions will have cleared and you won't have a company to talk to anyway. How much of this do you have documented? She said. Enough. Another pause. I've been building the files since I first flagged the communication anomalies. I just didn't have the internal transaction data to connect it until you gave me direct system access today. 8 months. He had been doing this for 8 months from a security station in the lobby with no authority and no resources because no one had acted on his flag and he had done what he could with what he had. She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. Send me everything you have, she said. Tonight. I'll get legal on a secure line in the morning and we'll figure out how to move. Okay. She almost hung up. Then she said, on an impulse she didn't fully understand, is Sophie asleep? A beat of silence, longer than she expected. Not yet. She's watching something. Why? No reason. She paused. Tell her. She stopped. She didn't know what she was about to say. She'd never spoken to Sophie in her life. Never mind. I'll talk to you in the morning. She ended the call. She sat in her office on the 41st floor, with the city lights spread out below her and the document archive open on her screen, and she thought about a little girl in a rental house leaning against her father's arm, about a man who had mapped potential abduction routes in his spare time and filed threat reports that no one acted on and said nothing about any of it. Not once, not in 3 years, because she had never asked. She thought about everything she didn't know about the people immediately around her and how much of that was her own architecture. The walls she'd built to prove she didn't need anyone to build them for her. The city lights were very bright. She turned back to her screen and kept working. The federal investigators came on a Thursday. Vanessa had spent 3 days preparing for that meeting with the kind of focused intensity she usually reserved for hostile contract negotiations, building the document package with Grant, cross-referencing his communication intercepts against the transaction data she pulled from Sterling's internal systems, constructing a timeline that was clean enough to hand to a federal attorney without requiring 20 minutes of explanation. Grant worked from her office for those 3 days, which was strange in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not unpleasant, just strange. He brought his laptop and a legal pad and a habit of writing things in a cramped, left-leaning hand that was almost illegible to anyone but himself, and he sat at the secondary desk near the window and worked in long, unbroken stretches without needing to fill silence with conversation. She'd had assistants who couldn't do that. The investigators were 2 women and a man from the Financial Crimes Division, with a 4th person who identified himself only as being from a different agency and did not elaborate. They sat in the Sterling conference room on the 38th floor and listened to Vanessa and Grant present the document package, and they asked precise, careful questions, and they gave nothing back in terms of reaction or acknowledgement. This was standard. Vanessa had dealt with federal agencies before, through the defense contracts, and she knew how to read a room where everyone was professionally trained to be unreadable. What she could read was the moment when the agent from the unnamed agency leaned forward slightly and asked Grant to walk back through the encrypted relay structure a second time. That lean meant the relay connected to something they already knew about. That meant the conspiracy was larger than Sterling Defense, which she had suspected and now felt certain of. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the investigators took copies of everything and told Vanessa to maintain normal business operations and not to confront or signal the board member, whose name was Philip Hargrove, 58 years old, 17 years on the Sterling board, a man who had given a brief but generous eulogy at her father's memorial service, until they gave her clearance to do so. She agreed. She shook hands with all 4 of them. She waited until they were in the elevator, and then she went back to the conference room where Grant was stacking the remaining document copies, and she sat down in a chair and put both hands flat on the table and stared at nothing for about 30 seconds. "Hargrove," she said. Grant didn't look up from what he was doing. "Yeah." "He spoke at my father's service. He told me," she stopped. "He told me my father was the most principled man he'd ever worked alongside." Grant was quiet. "I don't know why I'm surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised. I read the documents. I built the case." She pressed her palms harder against the table. "I'm just tired of the gap between what people say and what they actually are." Grant set down the papers and looked at her, not with the professional assessment she'd grown familiar with, but with something more direct, something that had given up on being careful. "Most people are 2 things at once," he said. "Hargrove probably meant what he said about your father, and he was also running a parallel operation to take what your father built. People hold contradictions longer than we want to believe they can." She looked at him. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "No," he said. "It's just true." She almost smiled. She didn't quite get there. "Go home," she said. "Sophie's going to be out of school in an hour." He checked the time. Some involuntary thing happened to his expression at the mention of Sophie. Not a smile exactly, more the small unlocking of a face that had been set in a particular position for several hours. "I'll be back in the morning." "You don't have to be." "I know." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I'll be back in the morning. Sit." She didn't understand how it shifted. That was the honest truth of it. She couldn't identify the moment or the mechanism. She could only trace the small accumulations that preceded the shift, the way you can trace erosion after the fact, seeing the changed landscape without having witnessed the change itself. It started with Sophie. Grant brought her to the office on a Saturday 3 weeks after the warehouse. Not out of necessity, he'd explained briefly when Vanessa encountered them in the lobby. But because Sophie's school was doing a building inspection that morning, and he had a review he needed to finish on the internal communication analysis. Sophie was 8 years old and small for it, with her father's dark coloring and a way of looking at the world with her chin slightly lifted, like she was prepared to argue with it if necessary. She looked at Vanessa with the frank, unfiltered assessment that children deploy before they've learned to disguise what they're thinking. "You're the one who lives in the big building," she said. Grant made a brief sound. "Sophie. That's what Aunt Ruth calls it, the lady in the big building." "It's an office," Vanessa said. "You live here?" "I live nearby." Sophie considered this with visible skepticism, then apparently decided the distinction wasn't worth pursuing. She was carrying a book with a picture of a marine biologist on the cover and a backpack that was slightly too large for her frame, the kind of thing a parent buys for longevity rather than current fit. She looked at Vanessa for another moment and then looked at her father and said, "Is there Wi-Fi?" "Yes," Vanessa said. "Okay." Sophie looked back at her. "Do you have a meeting today?" "Later." "Dad says you always have meetings." "Sophie," Grant said again with slightly more weight. "It's accurate," Vanessa said. Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied with this confirmation, and followed her father toward the elevator with the manner of someone who had visited enough adult workplaces to have developed a functional tolerance for them. Vanessa watched them go, the small girl matching her father's stride in a focused, determined way, and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not sentimentality, something quieter. The recognition of a shape of life she hadn't been close to in a long time. She ran into them again at noon in the second-floor break room, where Sophie was eating a sandwich and reading her marine biology book, with the absorbed focus of a person who has learned to disappear into books the same way her father disappeared into legal pads. Grant was on his laptop at the table across from her, reading something Vanessa couldn't see. Vanessa poured coffee from the communal machine, always worse than the one in her office, somehow more honest for it, and Sophie looked up from her book. "Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts?" Sophie said. "I did not know that," Vanessa said. 2 of them stop working when they swim. So they basically walk everywhere because swimming is too tiring. Sophie said this with the particular satisfaction of someone reporting a fact that validates a personal position. "I relate to that." Grant looked up from his laptop at this. Something crossed his face that was quiet and private and not meant to be seen. He looked back at his screen before Vanessa could decide what it was. "Do you like the ocean?" Vanessa asked. "I've never been." The matter-of-factness of it landed without drama. Sophie said it the way children say things that adults would soften, simply as a fact about her experience of the world. She looked back at her book. Vanessa sat down at the table with her coffee, which she hadn't planned to do. She sat there for 20 minutes. They didn't talk much, Sophie read, and Vanessa looked at the news briefings on her phone, and Grant worked on his analysis. But the particular quality of the quiet in that break room was different from the quiet in her office 40 floors up. Fuller somehow. Less like silence and more like the sound of people who didn't need to fill the space between them. She stayed until her assistant called about the afternoon meeting. Walking back to the elevator, she was aware that something had been put slightly out of alignment. Not uncomfortably, but noticeably, the way furniture moved 2 inches from its original position doesn't disrupt a room but makes you aware that you'd memorized the original arrangement. The things she learned about Grant Calloway in the weeks that followed came in pieces, the way things come when you are not asking directly but simply paying attention. He was at his desk by 7 every morning. Not because she'd asked him to be, she arrived at 8:30, sometimes 9, but because she eventually understood. He woke early out of habit too deep to change, and the apartment was quiet in the mornings after he got Sophie on the school bus, and the work was there to be done, so he did it. She found him once at 7:15 making coffee in the small kitchen off the executive corridor, using the good machine that she'd told her assistant to leave unlocked for the team they were building around the investigation. He looked up when she came in and said nothing about the fact that she was 90 minutes earlier than usual, and she said nothing about the fact that he'd been there since approximately the time she was still trying to decide whether to get up. He made decent coffee. Better than hers. She learned that he called Sophie every day at 3:20, not to check on her, but just to ask about her day, because Sophie would not spontaneously report the events of her day without a direct audience. She knew this because she heard the call twice through the open office door, his voice shifting into a register she didn't hear otherwise, less flat, more available. She overheard Sophie's voice once, loud through the phone, even at a distance. "Dad, you're not going to believe what Mason did with the paint." And Grant saying with complete seriousness, "Tell me everything," which Sophie then did, at length. She learned that he had nightmares. She didn't learn this directly. She learned it from a comment Ruth, his sister, made when she called one afternoon and Grant was briefly away from his desk. And Vanessa answered his phone by reflex, and Ruth said, automatically, "How bad was it last night?" And then registered that she was not speaking to her brother and apologized and hung up. Grant came back 30 seconds later and saw the expression on Vanessa's face and said, "She worries." And Vanessa said, "I know." And neither of them said anything else about it. She learned that he'd been to the warehouse district 3 more times since the rescue, during off hours, walking the routes. Not because he thought the threat was still active there, but because he needed to close the loop in his own head. She understood this without him explaining it, the same way she understood that when she ran numbers on a failed quarter 3 times past the point of usefulness, she was doing the same thing, finding the error, trying to make the math come out differently. She learned that Sophie had decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, or possibly an astronaut, and had not yet resolved which because, as she explained to Vanessa on a subsequent Saturday visit with the gravity of someone discussing genuine geopolitical complexity, the ocean and space are basically the same problem. They're both about surviving somewhere you're not supposed to be. Vanessa had thought about that for longer than she expected. The thing that happened between her and Grant did not announce itself. It crept in through small acts of ordinary coexistence. Coffee cups and shared document reviews and late evenings when the office was empty and they sat on opposite sides of the conference table arguing about risk assessment and what the federal timeline meant for Sterling's quarterly stability. He disagreed with her directly, which almost no one in her professional life did. Not with aggression, not with performance, just plainly, when he thought she was wrong, which was occasionally. And when she pushed back, he told her why he disagreed and didn't move off the position until she gave him a reason to, not just a rank. She found this, to her own surprise, more valuable than agreement. One evening in late December, she was still in the office at 8:30, finishing a board communication that required surgical precision given the ongoing federal investigation, and he appeared in the doorway with his jacket on and said, "Have you eaten?" She looked up. "Excuse me." "Today. Have you eaten today?" She thought about it. "I had something at noon." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite judgment and not quite concern and landed somewhere in the specific territory of someone who has watched a person make a particular mistake too many times to ignore it, while also understanding it is not fully his business. "There's a place near here that delivers until 9, he said. "I have another hour of this." "I know, I said it delivers." He didn't move from the doorway. "You can eat while you work. It's a thing people do." She looked at him for a moment. He was holding his jacket in one hand and his phone in the other, and he'd clearly been about to leave and had turned back, for reasons that she could read if she chose to. "Fine," she said. He ordered. She worked. The food arrived and they ate in the conference room at 9 o'clock, with documents spread across the table between them, and they talked about the Hargrove file and what the investigators had indicated in their last contact, and whether Sterling's in-house legal team needed to be briefed yet, and what the board restructuring would look like post-investigation. It was, objectively, a working dinner. That was all it was. But somewhere in the middle of it, between the argument about whether to preemptively brief the audit committee and the moment when Grant said, "You're wrong about the timeline," and she told him to show her why, and he laid out his reasoning, and it was in fact correct, Vanessa Sterling understood that she was sitting across from someone she trusted. Not because she'd decided to, not because the evidence had been reviewed and a determination made, but because trust had accumulated without her authorizing it, the way it does when you've been watching someone be exactly who they are for long enough that you run out of reasons to be skeptical. It was an uncomfortable realization. She had built an entire life on the premise that things you didn't authorize couldn't happen to you. She ate the rest of her food and went back to the board communication and didn't say anything about it. He probably knew anyway. The Sterling Annual Gala was a January event, established by her father, now in its 19th year, 400 people. The Meridian Grand Hotel Ballroom, which had hosted the thing so many times that the hotel events coordinator could set up the Sterling configuration from memory. Vanessa had always found it necessary and exhausting in equal measure. the performance of institutional confidence, the specific work of being approachable to the right people and unavailable to the wrong ones while appearing to simply be having a good time. This year, it carried an additional layer. The federal investigation was ongoing. Hargrove was still on the board, still attending, still shaking hands and accepting drinks from waitstaff, and talking to Sterling's senior investors with the easy fluency of a man with nothing to hide, which was either genuine sociopathy or professional-grade compartmentalization, and she had stopped trying to distinguish between the two. Grant had been against her attending. He'd said it plainly, 3 days before the event. The investigation is at a sensitive stage. Hargrove knows the timeline is moving. A crowded public event where your security detail is managed by people who may not all be clean is not a controlled environment. I've attended this gala every year since my father started it, she said. Missing it sends a message. Staying home sends a message that you're cautious. Attending sends a message that you're not paying attention to your own threat assessment. I'm the CEO of a defense technology company. I don't get to visibly flinch. He looked at her. She looked back. The argument continued for another 10 minutes and resolved the way their arguments generally resolved. Not with one person winning, but with an agreed modification. She would attend. He would be there. Not in his security staff capacity. She pulled him off that rotation weeks ago. But present, in the building, with a specific access configuration that he spent 2 days working out with the hotel's physical layout. He wore a suit she had never seen before. She noticed this when they arrived separately. Her by car from the penthouse, him already inside. And she spotted him near the east wall of the ballroom doing the same thing he always did, which was reading the room, mapping it, filing things. The suit was dark gray and slightly too formal for how he usually carried himself, which somehow made him look more human rather than less. She didn't acknowledge him. That was part of the arrangement. The first 2 hours went the way these things went. She moved through the room. She talked to the right people. She accepted a glass of champagne and held it without drinking it, and smiled at things that were only partially amusing. She had one brief, careful conversation with Hargrove that required everything she had to conduct naturally. He was as warm and collegial as always, mentioning that he'd spoken to his contact at the DoD about the spring contract renewal, asking after her health after the kidnapping with apparent genuine concern. And she told him she was fine and thanked him and moved away before she could say anything she'd need to account for later. She found Grant's position in the room twice in the first hour without being obvious about it. East wall, then shifted to the pillar near the service corridor entrance. He was always in her peripheral view without appearing to be. The third hour was when it changed. She was in a conversation with 2 investors from a mid-Atlantic infrastructure fund when she noticed, at the edge of her vision, Grant moving. Not the casual drift of someone changing positions, purposeful. Alert in the specific way she had learned to recognize over the past weeks. She extracted herself from the conversation with the minimal viable excuse and worked her way gradually toward the east side of the room. Her primary security detail, 4 people, the team she'd had for 2 years, was not where they were supposed to be. She'd been tracking them unconsciously through the evening, and now, looking deliberately, she could only locate one of them, near the main entrance and moving away from her rather than toward. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Parking level 2. Car issue with your vehicle. Driver needs your confirmation to proceed. She looked at it. Her driver had her direct line. He had never used an unknown number. He had never, in 2 years, texted her about a vehicle issue during an event. She texted Grant's number. Something is wrong. His response came in 4 seconds. I know. Don't move toward the exits. I'm coming to you. She put her phone away and moved instead toward the center of the ballroom, where 400 people provided the specific protection of visibility. She kept her posture exactly as it had been all evening, shoulders back, expression neutral, the face of a woman at her own company's gala who has no reason to be concerned. 3 years of boardrooms had made her very good at this. She found a conversation to insert herself into. 2 of Sterling's senior engineers discussing a propulsion contract. She contributed 2 technically informed sentences that required them to respond in substance, anchoring herself in the exchange. Across the room, she saw one of her missing security detail reappear from a side corridor and angle toward the restricted executive wing at the north end of the ballroom. He was walking with purpose, not scanning the room, not doing his job, doing someone else's job. Then she saw Hargrove. He was standing near the executive wing entrance. He appeared to be in conversation with two men she didn't recognize. Not Sterling employees, not investors she knew, faces that didn't have the look of guests so much as function. He was looking at his phone. He looked up and scanned the room. He was looking for her. And she understood in the space of 3 seconds exactly what was happening. The security detail redirected. The unknown text about her vehicle. The executive wing, restricted, private. 4 cameras that she now realized could be looped from the hotel's security panel the same way the B2 garage cameras had been looped in November. This was the second move. Her phone buzzed again. Grant. Executive wing north entrance. They're trying to move you there. Where are you? She typed back. Center of room. I see Hargrove. He's watching for me. His response? Stay there. I am 90 seconds away. She had 90 seconds. She counted them. She excused herself from the engineering conversation and moved slightly, keeping herself visible to the main ballroom cameras. The hotel's own system, independent of Sterling's security arrangement. She kept Hargrove in her peripheral vision. He said something to one of the unknown men. The man began moving through the room in her general direction, not directly, the indirect path of someone trying not to look like they're moving toward a specific target. 60 seconds. She thought about what Grant had taught her. Not formally. Nothing was formal with him. No structured lessons, no stated curriculum. But in the weeks since the warehouse, there had been small, practical transfers of knowledge. A conversation about situational awareness that turned into a demonstration in the Sterling parking garage. An afternoon when Sophie was at her aunt's and they were both working late, and he'd said, out of nowhere, if someone grabs you from behind, the instinct is to pull forward. It's wrong. You go into them. You create space by going toward, not away. And she'd said, show me, and he'd looked surprised and then shown her, carefully, methodically, the specific mechanics of it. She had practiced it 3 times. She thought about it now, the geometry of it, the counterintuitive logic. 30 seconds. The man moving through the crowd was 20 feet away. He'd adjusted his angle. He could see she'd moved. Hargrove was still at the north entrance, watching. Her security team was still absent, redistributed, pulled by whoever had enough access to redirect them. 15 seconds. Grant came through the service corridor entrance at the east side of the ballroom, suit jacket gone, moving fast and low and precise, and he had read the room in the 3 seconds it took him to clear the entrance because he angled directly toward the man moving toward her without hesitation. What happened next was fast and nearly invisible to anyone not specifically watching, which most of the 400 people in the ballroom were not, because they were drinking champagne and talking about quarterly projections and congratulating each other on the year. The man from Hargrove's group had 2 seconds of interaction with Grant and then was on a wall, not visibly, not with any significant drama, but in the manner of someone who has had a specific conversation with their own skeleton about whether to continue moving forward and has decided against it. Grant was at her side in the next moment. We need the server room, he said quietly. The hotel's network panel. Can you access Sterling's emergency broadcast system from a hotel terminal? She was already moving. If I can get to the hotel's network infrastructure, I can push through the Sterling executive server. Yes. How long? 5 minutes, maybe less, if the configuration matches the standard setup. You have 7. He was walking beside her, close, positioned between her and the north side of the room. Hargrove's people have a second team. They're going to realize the room intercept failed in about 4 minutes. We can't let this go to a second location. She looked at him. His face was very calm in the particular way it was calm when a situation had exceeded normal parameters, and the normal parameters were therefore no longer relevant. Grant, she said. Yeah. When this is over, I'm going to need you to explain exactly how many contingency plans you had for tonight. He almost smiled, something close to it. Ask me after. They found the hotel's network room through the service corridor, which Grant navigated from memory because he had, of course, walked the hotel's physical layout before tonight. The door required a key card. He produced one, and she decided not to ask how. The room was small, warm, smelling of electronics and recycled air. She sat down at the terminal, and her hands were steady in the specific way they got steady when the stakes were high enough that adrenaline became useful rather than disruptive. She found the network configuration. She found the bridge to Sterling's emergency executive protocol. She logged in with credentials that required 3 separate authentications, her hands moving through the steps without fumbling because she had logged into this system once a month for 2 years as a maintenance drill her head of IT insisted upon, and she had always considered slightly paranoid. She was grateful for it now. The emergency protocol pushed Sterling's internal communications, all of them, every thread in the active investigation file, directly to the federal regulatory contacts preloaded into the system, designed for exactly this kind of scenario, a governance emergency requiring immediate federal escalation. Grant stood at the door with his back to her, watching the corridor. "Done," she said. He pulled the door closed behind them as they left, and he said very quietly, "There are going to be people in federal suits in this building inside of 40 minutes. We need to be somewhere with cameras and witnesses when they arrive." Ballroom. Ballroom. They walked back through the service corridor toward the main event space, and somewhere behind them she heard, or imagined she heard, the specific frequency of a plan coming apart at the structural level, Hargrove reaching for something that was no longer there, the transactions that were supposed to clear never clearing, the company that was supposed to change hands staying exactly where it was. She straightened her dress as they approached the ballroom entrance, checked her hair, which was fine, composed her expression. Grant stopped just inside the door and she felt him shift back into the position he held all evening, adjacent, present, unobtrusive. She went back into the party. She accepted a new glass of champagne she didn't drink. She found the infrastructure investors and resumed the conversation she'd left. She stood in the middle of 400 people who didn't know what had just happened 20 meters away, and she was exactly what she always was in public, controlled, composed, certain. But she kept Grant in her peripheral vision. He was near the east wall again. Same position as the start of the evening. If she hadn't been watching for him, she wouldn't have seen him. She had been watching for him for weeks, she realized, without acknowledging that she was doing it. The specific awareness of where he was in any given space, the small recalibration that occurred when he entered or left a room. The way she'd started leaving the office kitchen with 2 cups instead of 1. The federal agents arrived in 38 minutes. When they did, the room shifted the way rooms shift when the nature of an event changes irreversibly. Hargrove was still near the north entrance. She watched him understand what was happening from 40 feet away. The specific freeze and then recalculation of a man who has just recognized that the thing he built over 18 months has come down all at once. She watched that happen. Then she turned away from it. She found Grant in the crowd because she always found him in the crowd now, apparently. And she walked toward him and he saw her coming and stayed still, which was his nature, waiting for whatever came next with the patience of someone who had learned that most things worth having required stillness before they arrived. She stopped in front of him. "It's done," she said. He looked at her. The ballroom was loud around them, 400 people beginning to understand that something significant was happening near the north entrance, the specific roar of collective confusion rising. "Yeah," he said. She looked at him, the man she had treated as furniture, the man who had mapped every possible route between her and danger, the man who made 2 cups of coffee without being asked, and called his daughter every day at 3:20, and carried a weight she couldn't fully see but had learned the shape of. The federal agents were moving through the room. Someone was raising their voice near the entrance. Vanessa Sterling stood in the middle of her company's annual gala and felt something she had been building walls against for 3 years. The particular vulnerability of having been wrong about something important, and knowing that the correction was not something she could engineer or schedule or approve. She just had to let it be there. "Sophie wanted to know if you'd ever seen the ocean," Grant said. Out of nowhere. Quietly, under the noise of the room. She looked at him. "You told her you'd never been," he said. "A few weeks ago. She's been thinking about it." "I've been to the ocean." "She means with someone," he said. And then, as if the sentence were a perfectly ordinary logistical statement, she thought maybe in the spring. The noise of the ballroom continued. The federal agents were making their way through the crowd. Somewhere near the north entrance, Philip Hargrove's 18-month operation was concluding in the way these things concluded, with forms and identifications and the specific, irrevocable language of federal authority. Vanessa thought about a little girl with a marine biology book who had never seen the ocean. "In the spring," she said. Grant nodded once. He looked back at the room, scanning, always scanning, because that was who he was. She stood beside him and let the evening do what it was going to do. The weeks after the gala were the loudest of Vanessa's professional life, and she had lived through some loud ones. Philip Hargrove was arrested that night before he reached the parking level. Two of the men from his group were detained in the hotel corridor. A third, the one Grant had redirected into a wall with such minimal visible effort, was collected by the federal agents from a service stairwell where he had apparently concluded that his best option was to sit down and wait. The fourth had already left the building, which the investigators told Vanessa about, with the specific clipped tone of people who intended to find him shortly and did not consider his departure a meaningful complication. The story broke the following morning, not through Sterling's communications team, not through a managed press release with approved language and strategic timing, but through a financial reporter who had apparently been tracking the nominee stock acquisition for 3 months independently and chose the morning after Hargrove's arrest to publish everything she had. By 9 a.m., Sterling Defense Technologies was the lead item on every financial news service in the country. By noon, Vanessa's communications team had logged over 200 press inquiries. She answered none of them personally for 6 days. 6 days. What she did instead was work. The board needed emergency restructuring. The federal investigation required her cooperation on a daily basis, sometimes twice daily, phone calls and document requests, and the specific exhausting back and forth of an institution trying to demonstrate transparency to a regulatory body while simultaneously not compromising an ongoing criminal case. Sterling's major defense contracts needed reassurance. The DoD had questions. The DoD always had questions. And those questions required her direct attention because no subordinate had the standing to answer them with the authority they required. Grant worked beside her through most of it. He had formally, on paper, become her Director of Internal Security Intelligence, a title they'd created together because nothing that already existed in the company's org chart adequately described what he actually did. He managed the forensic documentation for the federal case, coordinated with the investigators, and spent a significant portion of 1 week in conference calls with Sterling's outside legal team walking through the timeline of the encrypted relay communications he'd built over the preceding 8 months. One of the attorneys, a sharp, compact woman named Della Marsh, who Vanessa had worked with on 3 previous matters and trusted accordingly, called Vanessa after the second call with Grant and said, "With the measured approval of someone who does not distribute approval freely, where has that man been?" "Security desk," Vanessa said. A pause. "That seems like a waste." "It does now," Vanessa said. She meant it to sound dry. It came out with more weight than she intended. Della, who was perceptive in the way that good attorneys are perceptive, reading everything, commenting on almost nothing, simply said, and moved on to the next item on her list. The discovery that she and Grant had been waiting for. The confirmation that the stock acquisition connected to a rival defense firm called Axiom Strategic Partners, which had been positioning for a hostile takeover of Sterling for the better part of a year, came through the investigators on a Wednesday morning in late January. It was, in a way, the final piece. Everything else had been threads. This was the structure those threads were part of. Axiom had used Hargrove as an inside mechanism, the kidnapping as a governance disruption, and the nominee stock purchases as the financial scaffolding for a takeover that would have been, under the 72-hour emergency protocol, technically legal if obscenely corrupt. Vanessa read the full briefing document at her desk and then sat still for a moment, looking at nothing. Grant knocked on the open office door. He'd read the same document. "Axiom," she said. "Yeah. I've met their CEO, Marcus Vail. We sat on the same industry panel 18 months ago." She thought about it. A smooth, confident man in his early 50s who had said polite, collegial things about cooperation in the defense sector and asked thoughtful questions about Sterling's research pipeline. He shook my hand. "People tend to be polite to the things they're planning to take," Grant said. She looked at him. He said things like that sometimes, plain, exact, with no decoration around them, and they landed with the particular force of statements that have been reduced to their essential content. "The investigators are moving on Axiom directly," he said. "They said we should expect a formal announcement within the next 2 weeks. The criminal case against Hargrove is solid. The financial forensics are clean. And the stock positions will be unwound. The SEC is already involved on that side. He leaned against the doorframe. He still did that, kept a slight physical distance, the posture of someone available but not assuming. Sterling comes out of this with a cleaner board and documented evidence that your security protocols successfully detected and countered an 18-month coordinated corporate attack. That's not a bad story to tell the DoD. It's a better story if I tell it honestly. She paused. Including the part where my own security employee detected the threat 8 months ago, filed the flag, and was ignored. Something crossed his face. That doesn't need to be part of the story. It does, she said. It absolutely does, because if I'm going to restructure this company's internal intelligence function, I need people to understand why it needed restructuring. And the why is that we had the information and we didn't act on it because the person who had it wasn't senior enough for anyone to listen to. He was quiet. I'm not interested in building a case for my own competence on the back of a version of events that edits out my failures, she said. My father would have called that the beginning of institutional rot. Grant was looking at her with an expression she'd seen a few times now, something between recognition and the slight discomfort of someone who is not used to being seen clearly. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He went back to his desk. She went back to her board communication, which now needed to incorporate the Axiom revelation, and worked until 7. And when she looked up, Grant was still at the secondary desk near the window, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had arranged her life very deliberately around solitude, and that solitude had quietly become something else without her noticing when the rearrangement began. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for the 3rd week of February. It was always a large event. Sterling's shareholders included institutional investors, defense sector funds, and a significant number of individual investors who had held the stock since Harrison Sterling's tenure. The venue was Sterling's own building, the main auditorium on the 4th floor, which held 900 people at capacity and would, this year, be close to that. Vanessa prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, completely, and then more than that. She wrote the main presentation herself rather than delegating it to communications, which was unusual enough that her communications director mentioned it twice, and then stopped mentioning it when the expression on Vanessa's face indicated that the topic was closed. She reviewed it 6 times. She changed the ending 4 times. She told Grant about the ending change on a Tuesday evening because she told him most things now, not out of obligation, but because he was useful in the specific way that people are useful when they're honest with you. Not reflexively supportive, not managing you, just direct. I want to bring you into the presentation, she said. He looked at her across the conference table. They were eating takeout again. This had become, without discussion, a Tuesday and Thursday event, working dinners that were still nominally working but had accumulated enough non-working conversation around the edges that the distinction was becoming technical. What does that mean? I want to introduce you, publicly, to the shareholders, the board, the press. She kept her voice level. I want to tell them who you are. He set down his fork. Vanessa. She noted the name, not Ms. Sterling. He'd made the shift gradually, over weeks, and now used her name the way it should be used, without ceremony, as a simple address. I know you're going to have objections, she said. Several. Tell me them. He looked at her. I don't need recognition. I was doing a job. You were doing 3 jobs simultaneously with no authority and no resources because you cared whether this company survived and whether I was safe. That's not a neutral operational fact, Grant. That matters. It doesn't need to matter publicly. It does, she said. Because publicly, right now, Sterling Defense has a story about a CEO who survived a kidnapping and a corporate conspiracy. And that story is going to be told either by me or by journalists who have significantly less context and significantly more incentive to make it dramatic at the expense of the actual truth. She paused. The actual truth is that a security guard no one paid attention to was the reason the conspiracy failed. I want to tell that truth. He was quiet for a long moment. And the other thing, he said. Careful, specific. She knew what he meant. Yes, she said. That too. He looked at the table, then back at her. We've been married on paper for 3 years. I know. I'm not... He stopped, tried again. I don't need the public declaration, Vanessa. That's not what this is about for me. I know that too. She kept her eyes on him. It's about what it's about for me. I spent 3 years pretending you didn't exist because acknowledging you would have required me to acknowledge that my father might have understood something I didn't, and I wasn't willing to do that. She paused. I'd like to stop pretending you don't exist. Something in his face shifted. She'd gotten better, over the weeks, at reading the small changes in his expression. Better than she'd been at reading anyone in a long time. Maybe because with Grant there was no performance to parse through, just the actual face of someone trying to figure out what was true. There are going to be cameras, he said. Yes. A lot of them. It's a major corporate event with a significant press contingent. Yes. He looked at her with the expression of a man working through a cost-benefit analysis he already knew the conclusion of. Sophie's going to think it's funny. Sophie is going to love it, Vanessa said. She's going to narrate it to her entire class. He almost smiled, not quite. She will. So you're agreeing? I'm acknowledging the situation, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the office window, the city was doing what the city did in February, cold and lit and entirely indifferent to the small decisions of people inside buildings. Grant, she said, are you agreeing? Yeah, he said, I'm agreeing. The morning of the shareholder meeting, Sophie informed them at breakfast that she had prepared remarks. This happened in Vanessa's kitchen, a detail that still occasionally registered as strange to Vanessa when she stepped back from it. The fact that Grant and Sophie had been eating breakfast in her kitchen on weekends for the past month. Sophie installed at the counter with her marine biology book and a specific, non-negotiable requirement for orange juice. Grant making eggs with the focused economy of someone who learned to cook in conditions where efficiency mattered. Vanessa contributed coffee and, increasingly, her presence, which she offered without excess ceremony because ceremony had never been her strong suit, and Sophie, like her father, responded better to directness anyway. You prepared remarks, Grant said, not looking up from the pan. Yes. Sophie was 8 years old and had the self-possession of someone significantly older, which Vanessa had concluded was a combination of temperament and the specific maturity that comes from having been a parent's primary companion through difficult years. I wrote them last night. For what purpose? Grant said. In case anyone asks me questions. Why would anyone ask you questions? Sophie looked at him with the patience of someone explaining an obvious thing to a slow adult. Because you're going to be on a stage, and I'm going to be with you, and there will be journalists. You're not going to be on a stage, Grant said. Vanessa said I could come up. Grant looked at Vanessa. I said she could come up if she wanted to, Vanessa said into her coffee. She's 8. She's very composed for 8. I'm extremely composed, Sophie confirmed. Grant put eggs on 3 plates and set them on the counter and sat down in a way that suggested he was choosing, as he often did, to let a situation be what it was going to be rather than expend energy redirecting it. He ate. Sophie ate. Vanessa ate, which she would not have done 2 months ago. She would have had coffee standing up and called it breakfast and been at the office by 8. What do your remarks say? Vanessa asked Sophie. Sophie considered. Mostly I explain that my dad is very good at his job and also that he makes good eggs. Both accurate, Vanessa said. And I was going to say that he used to have nightmares a lot and now he has them less. Sophie said it with the same flat directness she used for everything, looking at her plate. Because I think that's important for people to know, that things can get better. The kitchen was quiet. Grant was looking at his daughter with an expression that Vanessa had never seen on his face before, completely unguarded, opened up in a way that his face almost never opened, something behind his eyes that was too large and too private to name. He reached over and put his hand briefly on top of Sophie's head, the gesture of a father who has run out of words, which for Grant was not a common condition. Sophie looked up at him. Is that okay to say? Yeah, kid, he said roughly. That's okay to say. Sophie nodded and returned to her eggs, satisfied. Vanessa looked at the counter surface and felt the specific aching fullness of a moment she had not been prepared for and could not have prepared for, and was grateful to be present in anyway. The auditorium was full. Not just the shareholder seats, the standing sections along the side walls held employees who'd registered for attendance, and the press area at the back had twice the usual contingent given the Hargrove story and the Axiom revelations. Vanessa had been in front of large audiences before. She had never felt this particular quality of attention, Not hostile, not skeptical in the usual corporate way, but genuinely waiting. People who had read the news and come to see what came next. She gave the presentation. It was 50 minutes of content. The company's performance, the investigation's outcome, the board restructuring, the forward strategy. She was precise and direct, and she didn't soften the accounting of what had happened. She said the word conspiracy without euphemism. She said internal betrayal without the kind of careful language that is designed to protect institutions from their own failures. She talked about the gaps in Sterling's internal intelligence structure and what had allowed an 18-month coordinated attack to develop within 2 board lengths of her office. She talked about the man who found it. She stopped at that point in the presentation and set down her notes. "There is something I need to do before I continue," she said, "and I want to ask 2 people to come forward." In the front row, Grant looked up. Beside him, Sophie sat very straight. Vanessa met Grant's eyes across the distance. He stood. He took Sophie's hand. They walked toward the stage with the specific, unperforming quality that was simply their nature. No theater, no awareness of the 4 cameras tracking them, just a man and his daughter walking toward something because they'd been asked. They stood beside her. 460 shareholders, 90 employees, 22 journalists. The cameras rolling. Vanessa took Grant's other hand. She felt him go still beside her, not tense, just still. In the way he went still when he was in a situation he hadn't fully mapped in advance and was reading it as it happened. "This is Grant Calloway," she said. Her voice came out steady. She'd rehearsed the words, and they still felt, in the saying of them, like something that required more than rehearsal. "He is a former Navy SEAL. He holds a Navy Cross and a Bronze Star with Valor. He spent 14 years in service before becoming a single father, and for the past 3 years, a member of Sterling Defense Technologies' security department." The room was very quiet. "He is also my husband." The eruption was immediate. Not chaos, but the specific roar of a room full of people processing something they had not expected. Cameras moved. People turned to each other. In the press section, she could see fingers moving on phones. She let it settle. Then she continued. "Grant filed a threat assessment 8 months before the kidnapping attempt in November. He identified irregular communication patterns suggesting coordinated threat activity and reported them through the appropriate internal channel. The report was dismissed because the person making it was not senior enough for anyone to take seriously." She paused. "I want to be plain about that. The system that was supposed to protect this company missed what it was supposed to catch, and it missed it because of an assumption about who was worth listening to. A security guard at a lobby desk, in the company's own chain of command, did not warrant the attention of the people whose job was threat assessment." The room had gone quiet again in a different way, more weighted. "I want to be equally plain about something else," she said. "For 3 years, I maintained a legal marriage while treating my husband as though he were invisible. I knew his name and his position, and I never once asked him anything about his life. I made an assumption about who he was based on where he sat in the building." She paused. "I was wrong. About the hierarchy that I thought determined a person's worth, and about the man standing next to me." She looked at Grant. He was looking back at her, and his face was doing the thing it rarely did, being completely present without reserve, without the careful management of what he allowed to show. She could see the cost of standing here, in front of all these cameras and all these people, for a man who by nature and training preferred to be unnoticed. He was paying that cost without complaint. She looked back at the room. "Grant saved my life twice," she said. "Once in November, in a warehouse in Fairfax County, and again at this company's gala in January, when the second phase of the conspiracy tried to remove me from this building in the same way." She stopped. "The second time he didn't wait to be asked. He mapped the threat, positioned himself appropriately, and acted when he needed to act. Because that is what he does. Not because it was his job title, because it is who he is." She felt Grant's hand tighten slightly around hers. Brief, then released back to its normal hold. Sophie, standing on Grant's other side, was looking at the audience with the composed interest of someone attending a very large version of something she has already thought through, which was precisely what was happening. When a journalist near the back called out, "Breaking protocol, unable to wait. Mr. Calloway, did you know about the threat before November?" The room went sharp with attention. Grant looked toward the voice. He was quiet for a moment in the way that was thinking, not evasion. I had indicators, he said. His voice carried without a microphone, which was the voice of someone accustomed to being heard in conditions where microphones are not available. Not certainty, indicators. I reported them and they went nowhere, and then I worked with what I had. And what did you have? The same journalist asked. Time, Grant said, and a good reason to use it. The journalist wrote something down. Others were writing. The cameras had not moved. Sophie tugged her father's sleeve. He looked down. Can I say my thing now? She said. Vanessa heard it. Grant heard it. The microphone, which was closer than Sophie had estimated, also picked it up, and the front rows heard it, and a ripple of something. Not laughter. Something warmer than that, more surprised, moved through the auditorium. Grant looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Sophie. Go ahead, she said. Sophie faced forward. She was 8 years old and small for it, and she had prepared remarks. My dad is very good at his job, she said clearly and without hurry, into the ambient sound of the room. And he makes good eggs, and I think people should know that things can get better, even when they're bad for a long time. She considered. That's all I have. The room responded the way rooms full of people sometimes respond when something true and unscripted arrives in a space that has been full of prepared statements, with the kind of silence that is actually acknowledgement, followed by the kind of sound that is not applause exactly, but close to it, the instinctive response of people who have recognized something real. Grant put his hand briefly on Sophie's shoulder. Vanessa looked out at 900 people and felt, under the performance of composure that she'd spent a decade constructing, something shift. Not collapse. She didn't fall apart. She was not built for falling apart in public or possibly anywhere. But shift. A controlled and conscious release of something she had been holding for longer than the 3 years of this marriage, longer than her father's death, longer than the years of proving she deserved what she'd been given. She had spent a long time being the only person in the room she fully trusted. She wasn't doing that anymore. After the meeting, there was an hour of press. Vanessa handled most of it alone, which was her preference. Grant had not signed up for a media career, and she wasn't going to draft him into one without his explicit willingness. He stood to the side with Sophie, who had produced her marine biology book from somewhere and was reading it on a chair near the stage stairs, apparently having concluded that the follow-up procedures were not her department. One journalist, a woman from a national business publication, who Vanessa had spoken to twice before and respected for her precision, caught Vanessa at the edge of the press cluster and asked, quietly, "The foundation. Can you tell me more?" Vanessa had announced it at the end of the presentation, after Grant and Sophie had returned to their seats. The Homefront Renewal Foundation. $25 million committed from Sterling's Community Investment Fund over 5 years, with additional pledges already secured from 3 defense sector partners she'd contacted the previous week. The mission, vocational support, mental health access, and family stability resources for veterans transitioning to civilian life and single parents navigating financial hardship. It came out of a conversation, Vanessa said, about what the gap actually looks like between leaving military service and building a civilian life. The structural void. The places where people fall through. She paused. I was told about that void by someone who had lived in it. The journalist wrote something, then looked up. And Grant Calloway is going to lead it. I've asked him to, Vanessa said. He hasn't fully decided yet. This was true. She had asked him 2 evenings ago over the Tuesday takeout that was now simply a Tuesday dinner, and he had looked at his food and then out the window and said, "That's a big thing to ask." And she had said, "I know." And he had said, "I'll think about it." And she had said, "Okay," and they talked about something else, because that was also something she'd learned about Grant, that he needed to arrive at significant decisions by himself, without someone camped on the perimeter waiting. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep on Vanessa's couch under a blanket she'd retrieved from the spare room without asking, and after Grant had covered her carefully and come to sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, going slowly cold in front of him, Vanessa had sat across from him and said nothing for a while. Then he'd said, "I don't know how to run a foundation. I don't know how to run a defense corporation," she said. "I learned. That's different." It's not that different. You know the population. You know the need. The administrative structure is the part you hire people for. He looked at his coffee. The part I know is the part that's hard to talk about. I know. Sitting in rooms telling people things are going to be okay when I'm not. He stopped. When I'm still working on believing that myself. The kitchen was quiet. The building was quiet around it, the specific late-night quiet of a city that hasn't entirely stopped but is slowed enough to remember it has a temperature. That's exactly why it should be you, Vanessa said. He looked at her. Because you're not going to tell anyone things they're not. You're going to tell them where the actual handholds are. She paused. That's rarer than people think. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She had learned the patience of that. Okay, he said finally. She nodded. It'll take time to build, he said. Things worth building do. He looked at her across the kitchen table. The man who had spent 3 years being invisible in her building, who had saved her twice, who had called his daughter every day at 3:20 and mapped threat routes in his spare time, and woken from nightmares he didn't discuss, and made good eggs, and sat in a hospital conference room telling a federal attorney how an encrypted relay worked, with the same flat patience he brought to every room he entered. You're going to want to be involved, he said. Not a question. Extensively. You're going to have opinions about the operational structure. Several. He almost smiled. The closest thing to a full smile she'd seen on his face, which, she had decided, was worth more than the full smile of most people she knew because it had not been cheapened by overuse. Okay, he said again. In the other room, Sophie slept on the couch with her marine biology book still open on the cushion beside her. Outside, February was doing what February does in Virginia, cold and gray and indifferent, the kind of weather that doesn't ask permission and doesn't apologize. Inside the kitchen, 2 people sat with their coffee and the particular quiet of something that had been a long time becoming and had finally, simply, arrived. The penthouse sold in March. Vanessa had not anticipated how little she would feel about it. She had lived there for 6 years, the entirety of her tenure as CEO, and the 2 years before her father died when she was already running enough of the company that going home to something smaller would have felt like a contradiction of what she was building. 6 years of that particular address, those particular windows, the specific silence of a 41st floor apartment at 2 in the morning when the city below has gone to its lowest register and you are the only person awake in a space designed for more people than are in it. She walked through it on the morning of the final handover, alone, which she'd asked for. Her heels on the hardwood made the same sound they always had, clean and precise, bouncing off walls that were now empty of the artwork her assistant had helped her select, and the shelves of industry reports and legal volumes she'd never quite admitted were more furniture than reading. The kitchen where she had made inadequate coffee for 6 years. The living room where she had eaten takeout from containers over her laptop on 1,000 Tuesday nights before a specific man started eating it across from her. The bedroom with the view she had considered the best thing about the place and had, in the end, stopped noticing sometime around year 3. She stood at the window for a few minutes. The city was very clear in the March morning, the kind of sharp, cold clarity that comes after rain, everything outlined a little harder than usual. She thought about her father in his hospital room, papers spread across the tray table, saying, I have one daughter and she is going to need someone close who knew what he knew. She had thought he was afraid of being replaced by his own absence, that the marriage arrangement was about control, a dying man's attempt to keep managing things from beyond the range of his own life. She had been uncharitable in a dozen small ways she hadn't fully accounted for until now. He hadn't been afraid for the company. He'd been afraid for her. Specifically, personally, in the way that parents are afraid. Not for the abstract version of their child who appears in public and performs competence, but for the one who comes home to a silent apartment and eats over a laptop and has convinced herself that this is enough, because the alternative requires admitting she's lonely. He had seen her more clearly than she'd wanted to be seen. She said nothing to the empty room. She was not the kind of person who talked to the absence of people she missed, but she stood there for a few minutes longer than she'd planned. Then she picked up her bag and walked out and didn't look back, because looking back at empty rooms had never once helped anyone. The house was in a neighborhood called Maplecroft, which was the kind of name that sounds invented but isn't. A quarter-mile from Sophie's school, 6 blocks from the community center, where the Homefront Renewal Foundation was establishing its first operational office, and 20 minutes from Sterling's headquarters by highway, 30 by the surface roads that Grant preferred in the mornings, because, as he explained once without elaboration, he liked to see where he was going. It was not a large house. 3 bedrooms, a backyard that needed work, a kitchen with a window over the sink that faced east and got the morning light in a way that made even bad coffee look reasonable. The previous owners had painted the living room a color that all 3 of them agreed, independently and then together, was the specific shade of green that someone had clearly loved very much and was completely wrong for the room. They repainted it on the first Saturday, Sophie in charge of the roller on the lower sections, Grant on the latter, Vanessa doing the trim with a small brush, and the focused attention of someone who is bad at this and determined to get better at it. She got paint on her forearm, her left shoe, and a section of the baseboard that required a second pass. Sophie documented the baseboard incident with her tablet and showed it to Grant, who looked at it with the studied neutrality of a man keeping a straight face with some effort. "I can see that," Vanessa said. "I'm archiving it," Sophie said, "for historical purposes." What history requires documentation of a baseboard? The history of you learning to paint. Sophie lowered the tablet. "Which is going well, mostly." Vanessa looked at Grant. "She's not wrong," he said, and then went back up the ladder before Vanessa could respond. It was a Saturday in late March, 53 degrees, the backyard still brown from winter, but with the specific tentative green at the edges that meant it had decided to come back. They worked until 3 in the afternoon and then stopped because Sophie had reached the limit of her attention for home improvement and had migrated to the backyard with her marine biology book and a blanket, which she arranged on the dead grass with the settled confidence of someone who has decided a thing is fine and made it fine by deciding. Grant came down from the ladder, and they stood in the living room looking at the finished walls, which were now a warm off-white that all 3 of them had chosen together at the paint store. Sophie holding the color swatches up to the light with scientific precision, Grant saying almost nothing and then pointing to the one they ended up choosing, which Vanessa had also been leaning toward but hadn't said. "Better," Grant said. "Much better," Vanessa agreed. He looked at the room. She looked at him looking at the room, and she thought, as she sometimes did, still, with a faint residual surprise, that she knew this man's face now. Really knew it. The way you know a face you have been in a room with enough times that it has become part of the landscape of your days. The small scar near his left eyebrow. The way his jaw set when he was working through something. The way his eyes changed register between the operational flatness of a man in a situation and the more human quality of a man at home, which was a word he was still getting comfortable with in its current application. "Sophie's going to want to do her room next," he said. "I know. She has opinions about the color." I assumed. "She wants it to be blue. Not a normal blue. She described it as the color of the ocean in documentaries, not the actual ocean, because the actual ocean is green and murky, and that's okay for the ocean, but not for a room." Vanessa considered this. "That's a fairly specific brief. She'll show you the reference photos." "Of course she has reference photos." He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, through the window over the backyard, they could see Sophie on her blanket in the brown grass, book open, apparently perfectly content with the temperature and the dead lawn and the general state of a Saturday afternoon. "She's gonna be okay," Vanessa said. She didn't mean it as a question, but it came out with a slight upward quality, because she meant it more specifically than it sounded. Not the vague assurance people offer children in general, but the concrete things she believed she was watching. Sophie, who had spent the early years of her life in the specific instability of a parent still finding his footing, who had moved between her father's apartment and her aunt's house in the Sterling building on Saturdays, who had delivered prepared remarks at a shareholder meeting at age 8 with complete self-possession. She was going to be okay in the specific way that children are okay when they have been loved consistently and honestly and without pretending things were simpler than they were. Grant was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "You've been good at it," Vanessa said. "The whole time. I want you to know that I see that." He looked at her. She had learned that the direct statements were the ones that landed hardest with him. He could manage complicated situations with complete equanimity and be undone by a plain sentence that said a true thing. "You haven't been watching the whole time," he said. Not as a criticism, just accurate. "No," she said. "But I've been watching long enough to know." He nodded. He looked at the repainted room. Then he said, "I want to talk to you about something." She waited. "The operation in 2019. He said it without preamble, which was new. He had not brought it up since the conference room in the early days of December, and she had not asked, and that arrangement had held through the months of the investigation and the gala and the shareholder meeting and the slow, unannounced accumulation of their actual life together. "I've been seeing someone, a therapist, for about 6 weeks." She kept her face still. "Okay." "Ruth has been after me to do it for 2 years. I kept saying I was fine." He paused. "I wasn't fine. I was functional, which is different." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." He looked at the window. It's not easy. Going back through it. It doesn't get easier just because you've decided to do it." He stopped. "But it's better than the alternative, which was spending the next 20 years being functional." "Are the nightmares less?" she asked. He looked at her surprised. "Ruth mentioned it," she said. "Months ago, by accident. I should have said something then. I didn't know how." He absorbed this. "They're less," he said. "Not gone. Less." She nodded. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "because I'm not good at—" He stopped again, started differently. "You share a lot with me. About the company, the decisions, what you're working on. I wanted to share something back that was actual." She understood exactly what he meant. He was a man who had spent years being the person who knew what was happening and said nothing, who managed everything from the perimeter without asking for acknowledgement. Saying the actual thing, the interior thing, not the operational summary, was a different skill, and he was practicing it with the same methodical commitment he brought to everything. She crossed the room and stood beside him, close, looking at the same window he was looking at. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say anything, but after a moment his hand found hers, and she held it, and they stood there in the newly painted room while Sophie read about marine biology in the dead grass of their backyard in the March cold, and the house settled around them with the particular sound of an old structure adjusting to new weight. The Homefront Renewal Foundation opened its first full operational office on a Thursday in April, which was not a significant date in any external sense, but happened to be the day the lease cleared and the furniture arrived and Sophie had a half day at school, and therefore was present for the ceremonial placing of the framed foundation mission statement on the wall, which she declared very serious looking, and then asked if there would be snacks. There were snacks. Grant had brought them, because Grant had been running the logistics of the foundation's first 6 weeks with the same patient, relentless competence he brought to everything, which had both confirmed Vanessa's instinct that he was exactly right for the role and caused her to reflect, not for the first time, on the specific waste of 3 years of having him verify badge access at the east entrance. She had said this to him once. He had said, "I wasn't ready before." She had asked what he meant. He had taken a moment to find the right structure for it, and then said, "I was functional. Functional people can do jobs. This is different from a job." He'd looked at her. "I needed to get somewhere that wasn't just functional, before I could do something worth doing." She had thought about that for a long time. The Foundation's first cohort of program participants was 22 veterans and 14 single parents, identified through a network of social services contacts, and 2 veteran advocacy organizations that Vanessa's legal team had partnered with in the planning months. They came in for orientation in the 3rd week of April, an orientation that Grant had designed himself, which was not, she had noted with some private amusement, a PowerPoint presentation or a packet of laminated materials. It was a conversation. Grant sat in a circle of folding chairs with 22 veterans and 14 parents and talked with them for 3 hours in a way that she observed from the back of the room and then had to leave after 40 minutes because something about watching it was more than she'd anticipated. Not because it was sentimental, it was the opposite of sentimental. It was plain and direct and specific, the way Grant was always plain and direct and specific. He said, at one point, "I'm not going to tell you that it gets easier because some of it doesn't. What I can tell you is that there are things that can be built, even when the ground doesn't feel stable. We're here to help you build them." And then, "I know what it looks like to keep everything working on the outside while the inside is something else. I did that for years. It works until it doesn't, and then it doesn't work at all." A man across the circle from him, mid-30s, Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, the specific careful stillness of someone who has learned to take up less space than he occupies, said, "So what changed?" Grant considered. "I let someone see what it actually looked like, instead of just the version that was functional. The man across the circle nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back up. That's hard. Yeah, Grant said. It is. She left after that because she was going to do something she had no interest in doing in front of 22 veterans and 14 parents. And she stood in the hallway of the Foundation's community office building and pressed her back against the wall and took 3 slow, deliberate breaths. The thing about Grant Calloway was not that he was exceptional. She had known exceptional people, brilliant people, decorated people, people whose accomplishments filled rooms. The thing about Grant was that he was honest. Honest about what he'd done wrong and what it cost, and what he was still figuring out in the specific, unglamorous way of someone who had stopped pretending the accounting was settled. That honesty was the most useful thing she had encountered in 10 years of professional life, and she had spent 3 of those years walking past it in a hallway. She thought about what her father had seen. Not the Navy Cross or the operational record or the tactical competence, which were extraordinary, but which her father, as a defense industry insider, had encountered in various forms before. He had seen the honesty, the specific quality of a man who would not perform adequacy when he had failed, who would not dress the accounting in better language than it deserved, who would look at you across a folding table and say the plain thing even when the plain thing was hard. Her father had wanted that for her. Not as protection, as a standard. The thought arrived quietly and settled without drama, the way true things often do. She straightened her jacket and went back to her car and drove to the Sterling offices, because there was a contract review scheduled for 2 o'clock, and she was still the CEO of a defense technology corporation, and that did not pause for personal revelations in community center hallways. Spring in Virginia was the kind of season that demanded acknowledgement, even from people who didn't generally pay attention to weather. The particular green of it, sudden and almost aggressive after the gray of February. Sophie had made good on her spring campaign, and on a Saturday in late May, the 3 of them drove 3 hours to a stretch of the Carolina coast. Sophie in the back seat with her marine biology book and a bag containing, as she had specified the night before with great precision, the following items: 2 towels, sunscreen, a container of crackers, and a notebook for recording observations. Observations of what? Vanessa had asked. Whatever requires observation, Sophie said, with the patience of someone for whom this was self-evident. Grant drove. Vanessa had her shoes off and her feet on the dashboard, which was something she had never done in a car in her adult life, and which felt, in the absence of any audience expecting anything from her, completely fine. They talked and didn't talk in roughly equal measure. Sophie reported, from the back seat, a selection of facts about the Atlantic seaboard's marine ecosystem, some of which were genuinely surprising, and at least one of which Vanessa privately suspected was extrapolated beyond what the source material actually said, though she did not challenge it. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon. The beach was not empty. It was a Saturday in May, but it was uncrowded in the way that coastal spots are uncrowded when the summer rush hasn't yet arrived. Sophie was in the water within 8 minutes, which was approximately 7 minutes longer than Vanessa had expected her to wait, and she went in with the specific fearlessness of a child who has been told about the ocean by books and documentaries and has therefore arrived with complete confidence in what she's dealing with, which is both charming and slightly concerning to watch. Grant stood at the water's edge with his shoes in one hand and his pants rolled up and watched his daughter. Vanessa stood beside him. The water was cold. Sophie did not appear to notice or care. "She's not afraid of anything," Vanessa said. "She's afraid of some things," Grant said. "She just doesn't show them the same way. She's like you." He considered that. In some ways. He watched Sophie jump a small wave with complete commitment. Her mother was braver, though, in the ways that matter. She said the hard things out loud without having to work up to them first. It was the most he had said about Sophie's mother in all the months Vanessa had known him. She didn't push at it. She let it stand. "Does Sophie talk about her?" Vanessa asked. "Sometimes. More lately." He looked at the water. "I think she's been working out how to have more than one thing at once. Her mom and whatever this is now." He paused. "I don't want her to think it's one or the other." "Has she said that? That she thinks it's one or the other?" "No, she said—" He stopped. A small smile, the real kind, the kind she had catalogued and valued because of its rarity. "She said her mom would have thought you were very efficient." Vanessa felt the complicated warmth of that. That's possibly the kindest thing anyone has said to me." She meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. Sophie turned from the water and waved at them with large, full-arm enthusiasm, which they returned, and then Sophie went back to the task of being in the Atlantic Ocean, which appeared to require her complete attention. Vanessa thought about efficiency, about the years she'd spent being very efficient at her life, optimizing, structuring, removing the variables that introduced uncertainty. She had been good at it. She had also been, in the specific way of people who are very good at control, deeply alone, and told herself that the aloneness was the cost of the accomplishment and was therefore worth paying. She was not sure when she had stopped paying that particular bill. It had been gradual, the way the important things tend to be. A security guard she started to look at. A little girl with a marine biology book. A man who made 2 cups of coffee and mapped threat routes, and woke from nightmares and called his daughter every afternoon and sat in conference rooms telling the truth about what he had done wrong with the same plain voice he used for everything. She had not fallen in love the way it happens in the stories people tell about falling in love. There had been no moment, no scene with appropriate lighting. It had been more like noticing, over and over and in accumulating increments, that someone had become necessary. Not in the dependent way, not in the way of people who need someone to function, but in the way of a thing that has become part of the structure of your days and whose absence would not just be felt, but would change the shape of everything around it. She didn't know exactly when it had happened. She knew it had happened. She was not, at this point, particularly interested in the timeline. "Grant," she said, "yeah, I want to say something, and I want you to just let me say it without doing that thing where you deflect the serious parts." He looked at her. "What thing?" "The thing where I say something that matters, and you say okay or yeah, and move on before I can tell if you heard it." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay?" She gave him a look. "That was the last one," he said. "Go ahead." She looked at the water. Sophie was jumping waves again. The coast stretched in both directions, quiet and particular. "I was wrong about what I thought my life should look like," she said. "Not the company. The company I understand, I know what that is and what it requires. But everything else. I built a very efficient life that didn't have room for anything that couldn't be scheduled, and I told myself that was strength." She paused. "It wasn't strength. It was just a very organized version of being afraid." He said nothing. He was listening. I'm not good at this," she said. "At the softer things. At saying things like this without running the sentence 3 times first and making sure the logic holds." She looked at him. "The logic holds. That's what I'm telling you. I've run it enough times. You are not what I expected, and you are not what I would have chosen if someone had given me a checklist because I would have made the checklist wrong. But you are what I would choose now. If that's..." She stopped. Tried again. "You and Sophie. This life. I'm choosing it deliberately, not because of what my father arranged, because of what I actually know now." The water was cold at their feet. Sophie was in it up to her knees. Grant was looking at her with that expression she'd catalogued. The completely unguarded face, the one that cost him something to show. "I know," he said. "I'm not sure you do, because you tend to assume the best-case version of what people mean and miss the specific thing they're saying." Vanessa. He said her name the way he'd learned to say it, not the formal address of an employee, but the way you say a name that has become familiar by being used in real conditions. "I know." He held her eyes. "I've been choosing it too, for a while." She believed him. She had learned to believe him because he did not say things he didn't mean, which had taken some adjustment, coming from a world where almost everyone said things they didn't fully mean as a matter of professional survival. Down the beach, Sophie had made a discovery of some kind. She was crouching over something at the water's edge with the intense focus of a scientist on the verge of something. She looked up and shouted something at them that the wind took. "What did she say?" Vanessa asked. "Something about a crab," Grant said. "Or a clam. She's going to need her notebook." Vanessa went back to the bag for the notebook and the container of crackers, because it was the kind of afternoon that required crackers, and brought them to Sophie, who received them without looking up, and immediately began writing down observations about what turned out to be a very ordinary hermit crab that Sophie nonetheless described in terms that suggested it was a significant find. Grant came up behind them and crouched down to look at the crab, and Sophie narrated its relevant characteristics, and Vanessa sat in the sand with her shoes off and her good pants getting damp at the hem, and listened to an 8-year-old explain the biological advantages of carrying one's home, which she thought, privately, had some resonance she was not going to point out. The afternoon went on. The hermit crab was eventually released to its business. Sophie moved up the beach to record other observations. The sun tracked toward the water. They ate the crackers and bought bad hot dogs from a beach stand and ate those too, standing up because there was nowhere to sit, and Sophie was hungry, and the line was long, and no one wanted to wait for better options. Grant ate his hot dog and looked at the ocean. "I used to think the only things worth doing required something to fight," he said. Not out of nowhere. It had the quality of a thought that had been sitting somewhere and had found its moment. "I measured the value of things by what they cost. Operations that were dangerous, situations with high stakes." He paused. "I think I used the cost to prove the value, because if it was hard, it must have mattered." Vanessa looked at him. "And now?" "Now I'm not sure that's the right math." He looked at Sophie, who was 50 yards up the beach, investigating something in a tide pool with the same total commitment she brought to everything. "This costs less and matters more, which doesn't compute the way I was trained to compute things. Maybe the math was wrong. Maybe." He ate the last of his hot dog. "Probably." She thought about the version of strength she had spent a decade constructing. The armored, efficient, needs-nothing version. The one that performed certainty in every room and called that competence. She had been good at it. It had gotten her through her father's death and 17 quarters of bored skepticism, and a kidnapping and a conspiracy, and the specific grinding work of building an institution that deserved to exist. But it had not, until recently, gotten her to a beach in May eating a bad hot dog with sand in her shoes, watching a child she had not anticipated record observations about a hermit crab in a notebook. She thought there might be an argument that the second thing required more actual strength than the first. The first was about keeping things out. The second was about letting things in, which is harder, and which cannot be optimized, and which gives you no control whatsoever over what you end up carrying. She was carrying something now that she had no control over and no plan for managing. She had decided, after some deliberation, that this was acceptable. More than acceptable. Sophie came back down the beach with her notebook and her full-arm wave, and announced that she was ready to leave when they were, and also that she was still hungry, which Grant addressed by producing a second container of crackers from the bag with the specific, unsurprised competence of a parent who has been packing contingency crackers for years. They walked back to the car in the late afternoon light, Sophie between them, eventually taking both of their hands with the decisive ease of a child who has made a determination about how things stand and does not require it to be discussed. Grant on one side, Vanessa on the other. Sophie swinging their arms once, experimentally, and then abandoning that in favor of walking at her own pace. The drive back was quieter. Sophie fell asleep in the back seat around the first hour, marine biology book open on her lap, notebook beside her with the day's observations catalogued in her round, emphatic handwriting. Grant drove. Vanessa watched the highway and the dark coming down over the Virginia countryside. She thought about her father, who had looked at a man in a hospital room and seen something worth betting on, who had arranged an unlikely thing because he understood that the right people placed in proximity to each other sometimes become, over time, the kind of thing neither of them would have thought to choose for themselves. She thought he had not been sentimental. He had just been paying attention. It was, she had concluded, the most important skill, the one she had been slowest to develop and was still developing. The ability to look at what was actually in front of her, not the categorized, analyzed version, not the entity whose position in the hierarchy determined how much attention it warranted, but the actual person, in the actual room, doing the actual thing. Grant, at the security desk. Grant in the warehouse, amber light on his face, saying "You okay?" like it was a simple question. Sophie in the break room, informing her about octopus hearts with the authority of someone for whom knowledge is not leverage but simply interesting. The house with the backyard that needed work, and the badly colored room they'd fixed together, and the kitchen with the east window where the morning light made bad coffee look better than it was. None of it was what she had planned. She had been a very good planner. She was going to have to get comfortable with the limits of planning, which she was doing, gradually, in the way of someone learning a new language by being immersed in it rather than studying the grammar first. "Grant," she said, quietly, so as not to wake Sophie. Yeah. I'm glad my father was paying attention. He was quiet for a moment. The highway went on. The dark had settled fully now, and the headlights made a corridor of it. Yeah, he said, me too. She looked at the road ahead of them. Sophie breathed in the back seat with the full, uncomplicated breath of a sleeping child. The miles went on. There was a house with their things in it. There was work in the morning, for both of them, the real kind, the kind that required showing up honestly rather than just competently. There were veterans and parents who would come to a foundation office and sit in folding chairs and have a conversation with a man who understood what it was to have the gap between the functional version and the actual version, and who could tell them, without pretense, where the actual handholds were. There was a little girl who had prepared remarks about eggs and nightmares and things getting better. There was a marriage that had started as a document and become something neither of them could fully have prepared for or planned, which was probably the only way real things ever become real. Vanessa settled back in her seat. She let the road do what the road does, which is simply continue. She was not alone. She had not been alone, it turned out, for longer than she'd known. She had just needed to stop